Welcome to FacingMelsMusic.com podcast, featuring some of the most heartwarming stories from musicians all around the world on FacingMelsMusic.com.
Well, a very warm welcome to Facing Mel's Music. This is Mel Golding, and I have a very, very special guest. Really, really interesting to speak with Joshua Lastine. Very warm welcome. Lovely to have you here.
Thank you, Mel. Thank you, audience, for having me. Excited to be here.
Amazing. Now, let me get this right, okay? You are an entertainment lawyer.
I am an entertainment lawyer. I'm an attorney who practices transactional entertainment law, meaning I do contracts. I don't go to court. I don't wear a suit. Obviously, I don't argue in front of a judge, law and order style like you see on TV, but I help negotiate contracts on behalf of actors, writers, musicians, and then as well as entertainment companies like production studios, film and television, record labels, music producers, publishers, and the like. So I say anyone who wants to make cool stuff and needs a contract written and drafted and negotiated, I'm your guy.
Wow, you're the go-to person. I have to say, I was expecting you to wear a suit and a tie.
No, I figured I would.
Yes,
I'd
Guns
show
and
up
Roses.
in the shirt, fresh from the concert last month. So
wow. Yeah. I mean, are you a musician yourself? I am
not a musician.
Okay.
I'm a music advocate. Obviously, I'm an advocate for the arts. I love everything there is to do with music, but I don't have a musical ear / can't play an instrument to save my life / couldn't sing or carry a tune in a bucket. But I have no end to appreciation and respect for musicians.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. I mean, we'll get into what you do, in a minute. And I think the topic for today is kind of what creators need to know to protect themselves. That's what I have here. Is that kind of what we're going to be talking about today? I mean,
I mean, we can let the conversation go and flow. I'm pretty open to a lot of different topics, but I'm an entertainment connoisseur and entertainment media connoisseur. So protecting artist advocacy, trends, and what's going on in my industry and how that relates to music. All of the above is fair game.
It's amazing. It's great. What inspired you to get into this particular area?
It's really funny, but I'm from a small town in the middle of nowhere.
Okay.
But I always knew I wanted to be an entertainment lawyer. Back growing up as a kid, the old Star Wars VHSs, if you remember back when VHSs were a thing, if you fast forward to the end, they had what would eventually become the behind the scenes footage, right? And they had like a miniature making of. And when you watched that making of portion of those movies at the time, they would have interviews with studio executives, with lawyers, with business affairs, studio personnel that would talk about the business aspects and the contracts that went into making the movie, and the deals that took place between people like James Cameron and George Lucas and Fox and Steven Spielberg and all these people. And so I realized very, very early on as a kid that there's a whole, business that goes into getting artists where they need to be, whether that's in front of a camera or behind a microphone, on stage or wherever. There's got to be lawyers and business affairs folk that help those artists make those deals. And that's what I wanted to be a part of. So I moved out to Los Angeles in 2010, 2011. I didn't know a single person, but I ended up contacting my aunt's ex-husband's boss's wife's sister's kid.
Just working that one out. Okay.
Who was an attorney for American Idol, which was really cool. And I got my first job working at American Idol, working in music licensing, accounting, and business and legal affairs. So I was the guy at the end of each season who would watch the show. I would time out the recordings for each song that's used, whether it's visual vocal, background vocal, instrumental background, et cetera, et cetera. make sure that that corresponds with our rights license with each of the prospective record labels and publishers, time them out accordingly, and make sure that the checks for the usage were going out in correspondence with those licenses, and making sure everything lined up and okay. Essentially just back house accounting for the show. But I actually got to return to the show in 2014, I think it was, and got to work directly with the top 30 Hollywood contestants as they signed their 360 deals. So, when they bring the top contestants off of the road, off of the trials or whatever they call it, I forget now, they bring everyone to Hollywood, and they have all of the for lack of a better word, kids, I guess, all of the contestants sign a 360 contract with American Idol, and they pick a lawyer, and they sit down and they work with the lawyer, and they work with American Idol's lawyer to sign a contract that eventually becomes the contract if they win the contest, or if the studio, second place sometimes can get optioned for stuff too as well. So that was kind of, two very music heavy roles that I worked in. More day to day, I help put film and TV together. I put, actors and producers together. I do rights acquisitions. I put, actors in front of sets and get set pieces and visual effects done. But a lot of my job on the post-production side is to work with the music supervisor, to work with the composer, and to work with our head of creative to make sure that we're sourcing the correct music and getting all the music licensing done for the TV and film, whether that's the main title card sequence or anything that goes into the film itself. So even though I wouldn't consider myself a music lawyer the way that there are people who do practice solely music law, a lot of my job as it relates to TV and film and even talent representation dabbles in music.
That's really interesting. It's so involved, isn't it? So much. It's very complicated, isn't it? Because you're looking at several things, several perspectives, obviously, and to get that paperwork in place. And it's something that you said before. It's that bridge to making it. It's that difference for, like you said, getting behind the camera or behind the microphone. That is such an important part that you're offering here. That you actually, it's an integral part to making the difference between just being hidden, I suppose, to actually getting somewhere, that exposure. It's such a huge bridge, that what you're doing there. Amazing.
Yeah, and to give you an example, just today, I just signed a new client who's a pretty prolific reality TV star celebrity, and she's about to launch a new podcast. And we want to launch as soon as January 8th, January 10th, January 15th, or whatever it is. So a month from now. But since we're running up against the Christmas holiday, we have to make sure that those deals get done today to make sure that the money flows correctly, to make sure that she can go into production on her podcast on time to meet her January shoot schedule and get her hosts lined up. So, it is very involved. I don't think people realize that when you're listening to something or you're watching something, if it's mainstream or broadcast or Netflix or streaming, every single aspect of that production has to have a contract, and it usually goes through an attorney's hands.
Yes, of course. Absolutely. It has to, because this is protection, isn't it? And it's important that the listeners are hearing that element of protection, which is obviously what we're talking about. It's protecting the artist. It's also protecting the agency, I guess. And it's having that thing in place that it's instilling order, I suppose, to ensure that it all runs smoothly, so the outcome can be successful and happy, hopefully. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a team of people that you work with? Are you a team of people?
So I do have two other attorneys that work underneath me, two associate attorneys, an executive assistant, and then a finance team. So we're building out. We're not that big, but that's actually kind of better for us because we can stay lean. And we can be flexible with clients, and we can work with artists that we believe may have, longer futures or have a career long term that we can help build out. You know, we're only in business now for 3 years, despite the fact that I've been practicing, you know, for 10 years. My firm is relatively new, so we're growing and expanding along with our clients.
Fantastic. So, I mean, do you work directly with the artists, or are you working with producers or the managers? I mean, how does it, who approaches you? How does it work?
Everybody. So generally speaking, when I'm representing a musician who has a contract that, you know, would require someone like me to come on board, they usually already have a music manager, and I would probably work directly with them because they're their, you know, first line of defense. That being said, I do work with a lot of musicians who have tried to, you know, skip the manager route, or they've had success on their own and getting their own deals, and they come out and reach out to me directly. I represent a lot of artists in negotiating their manager deal. So their manager comes to them and is like, hey, sign this deal. You know, you're signing away 20-30% of your life. Oftentimes those deals are shoddily written, and you know, an artist wants to make sure that they're protected, so they'll bring it to me in advance to make sure that there's nothing hiding or lurking within the contract itself that they need to be aware of. You know, like I said, I also represent, you know, studios and production companies that are either making physical TV shows or film, or making content of any source. And in those instances, we're hiring composers, we're hiring hire music producers, we're hiring songwriters, and it would be my job then to work on the behalf of a studio, like you said, to maintain order. So, you know, a lot of that is making sure that expectations are met in terms of timeline for deliverables, who's covering what costs for what the artist's credit is, where payments are being sent, timeline of payments, and stuff like that. And then on the flip side too, it just makes me that much better an advocate. You know, I'm negotiating right now for a team of composers that I represent on a film project. And so it's you know, it's kind of like riding a bicycle in reverse. I do it for both the studio, and then I do it both for the artists themselves.
Interesting. I can imagine that the obviously it's probably a silly thing to say, but depending on who you're working for, what you're writing up, there's a different layout contractually. There must be, in terms of that must be super involved.
I always say that the person who controls the purse strings, the person who's paying the money, the person who's doing the hiring should be the one that controls and writes the contract. It's not always the case when parties are a little bit more at the independent level. But obviously, when you get to the major players, your Sony, your Warner Chappell, your anything like that, they're going to be the ones the contract and controlling that. It's a little bit like sports, where it's like whoever controls the draft contract has a little bit of home field advantage. But that can vary depending on who I am representing. You know, again, I represent sometimes singing, songwriting artists who are hiring a producer, and if it's the artist who has the leverage, if it's really the producer that wants to work with the author, with the artist so bad, then the artist gets to take the contract, and vice versa. Prolific producer, but the artist has less leverage, than the producer kind of can dictate the contract. So it is a lot about leverage as well. I will say that, you know, I think it's very it's a misconception that these contract negotiations and contracts in general are to be combative or in some way, you know, adversarial. I don't see contracts that way. I really see that, you know, when two parties are coming together, they're coming together to make something. And if you're already adversarial at, you know, what I would call the flirting stage or the courting stage, if you're already at each other's throats at that stage, once you get married, once you sign the contract, things are not going to go smoothly. So you really, you know, only want to get into contract with people that you feel that this is going to be a
Mm,
worthwhile opportunity to
mm,
pursue long term, and you kind of see
mm.
people's true colors through the contract
Yeah.
negotiation
Yes.
stage. If you get to a point, before signing, and the other side is like just
Mm.
being extremely unreasonable, that's a red flag
Yeah, I would
before you
say
go
so.
down the aisle.
Absolutely. I love the analogy. It's great, but it's so true, isn't it? You're signing a life
Yeah,
away,
yeah,
which is
yeah, yeah.
which is why, I mean, they say I've had so many conversations over the years with several, people that I've worked with as well, and there's not actually been a need to have any kind of contract because the trust has been there, and there's been something really lovely about that kind of a working relationship. But of course, when it gets into money and the slice of the pie, let's say, then what I remember hearing, worked with a very big record producer back in the 90s, and he would say, "Oh, you see, all of a sudden the dynamics change like that. They can change,"
Yeah.
which is so sad, and all this falling out that can actually happen over money, percentage, who gets what, and I guess even role as well, like the role of producer or singer songwriter, or I guess that must come into it as well, defining the roles.
Honestly, I see more
Yeah,
deals blown up over definition of roles, who's doing
yeah,
what,
yeah,
placement of people's
yeah.
position and ego, more
Oh,
so than it is about money. Money is usually actually the easier of the things
simple.
to figure out. Where I see contracts die on the vine
Yeah,
is in the creative control process and the who's doing what, and can we even reasonably move forward because both parties are again already at each other's throats over stuff. So it's funny that
mm,
how often money is usually the first thing that's solved, and it's
yeah.
really all the X, Y's, and Z's that
Oh,
can potentially hold up or prevent a deal.
it's interesting you mentioned that word ego. Do you know how often that word comes up when I'm talking to people? Ego.
Probably could have been.
I mean, do you think some of it is this fear maybe behind sort of not being recognized for what they're doing, or there must be a fear of not being seen or portrayed in the correct light, something, maybe a recognition or something, I guess.
I would
Mm,
say, as it relates to music in
yeah.
general, there's a long
Mhm.
history of artists being screwed, pardon my French, out
Mm,
of lots of money through bad business deals and bad contracts. And the
yeah.
record industry and the publishing industry has always had issues of payola plagola issues and
Yeah.
backdoor deals with artists and hiding money through shady accounting and stuff. So
Yeah.
so I get why artists would feel burned, but I
Yes.
also think that I talk about this in my entertainment
Yeah.
law, my music law class.
Okay.
Music law is one of the most misunderstood aspects of the Copyright Act.
Mm,
And music decisions, music legal decisions, music trial decisions
mm,
are wildly inconsistent.
yeah.
And oftentimes they're decided by judges and lay people who don't
Mm,
have the verbal lexicon or have the knowledge
yeah.
of how music is written, how it's read, the terms of art within it. And I
Yes.
can't even myself pretend to be a
Mm,
expert having extensive
mm,
music law,
yes.
experience. I don't know how to read sheet music.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to like
Yeah.
actually litigating music cases about copyright infringement,
Yep.
those
Mhm.
cases are often going to judges and juries who are lay people who don't know any more than average Joe on the street about music, and so that can lead to
Mm,
wildly inconsistent decisions. So again, I understand
mm,
why artists feel burnt on the music side of things and
yeah.
why they're
Yeah.
more hesitant to how do I say, go with the flow as it relates to.
Mm,
I have a lot of music students who, want me to read to them and explain to them contract provisions. And, if you're reading a contract, the language the contract uses itself is super scary.
I
It
know.
is. It's super
I've
scary, but
seen it.
oftentimes it's oftentimes that's just the way that it is, and it's just the way
Yeah.
that it's. written, and there is a big difference between how the contract is written on paper and the relationship between the artist and the producer, the artist and the company or whatever. And so it's like, you do want a lawyer to read it, but you want to trust that your lawyer can point out to you what is a reasonable red flag and like what is, oh, that's just customary work for hire language.
Right.
You don't like the work for hire language? I'm sorry, everyone does a work for hire deal.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'll explain to you what work for hire is, but you're not gonna own your masters outright on your first album.
Yes, exactly. Yes, this is it. And I think this is why a lot of, obviously I'm talking about musicians here. Of course, I do interview some actors as well, and I'm kind of going into that whole terrain as well. But I know more about music industry and musicians and how they feel. So I'm kind of the advocate for musicians and how they feel and protecting their rights. And I think a lot of the times there's this great big fear of being, I say ripped off, being copied. So, for example, there's all these stories, where there's been a piece of music circulating and no one's really signed it, but then someone else bigger and more famous has come out with something similar or taken an aspect of that. And I hear that happens a lot. And there's really very little you can do about that, isn't there?
Honestly, this is something that comes up quite a bit in conversation in class. Drake has problems with sound-alikes, copycats, and people bootlegging his music. The mass downloading of illegal music has been going on, for 23 odd years. And all of the biggest players, between Jay-Z and his Tidal and, like Spotify and Amazon and all that stuff, even they can't, essentially stop and prevent hackers and downloaders and copycats and sound-alikes. So, you can do your best to protect yourself by filing for copyright protection. Yes. You can do your best to protect yourself by building a brand for yourself, building brand awareness, creating a website, creating CDs, merchandise, getting trademarks and things of that nature. But if somebody wants to come in and copy you, like Vanilla Ice copied Queen and David Bowie with Ice Ice Baby.
Yes, baby. Yeah.
If someone wants to copy you, what's going to happen is worst case scenario, they're going to owe you money usually. And you can try to go after that money, but more often than not, it's going to cost you money to go after that money. So you better hope they're making a lot of money.
Yes, right. And this is it. And this is the difficulty, isn't it? This is the difference between being big, famous, powerful to the aspiring musician who's starting out and doesn't have those funds, because it is all about the money. It's what you said about 10 minutes ago. It's who's holding the purse strings, and it is still about that. That is it. Full stop.
Well, it can actually go in reverse too. I have had clients that come to me and they're like, "Hey, does this song sound too much like Guns N' Roses?" Or, "Hey, does this song sound too much like AC/DC?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, it probably does." And they're like, "Well, what's the worst that can happen?" And oftentimes, depending on what they can do for it, I like to say sometimes clients are quote unquote judgment proof, especially if they're broke artists themselves, and or it's hard for AC/DC to police the world, right?
Right, so exactly. That's true.
Sometimes it kind of, in my mind, the law all evens itself out, but it is important for artists to now more than ever look at brand awareness and making themselves as big as they can as a brand. To me, that's the way that they protect themselves more than any sort of legal protection. Because at the end of the day, legally, if someone copies you, the worst that's usually going to happen is they're going to owe you money. You can try to file an injunction on them, but again, money is usually the outcome.
It is, absolutely. And I guess, so really your advice is to protect as much as you can, raise the branding, which I guess is the branding is attached to that element of protection. This belongs to us, clearly, because we've got the branding behind it. the stamp.
So common law copyright protection begins when an original work of authorship is fixed in a tangible medium. So the moment you hit record or the moment you hit pencil to paper, you have copyright protection in your notes, lyrics, compositions, and voice recordings. The problem of that is making the world aware and known of your ownership, which, step number one, file for copyright protection, especially if it's a finished product. Yeah. But then step number two, let the world be known. Let it be known anywhere that this is your song. And then if it's ever a question that comes down the line in the future, you have this, kind of more practical paper trail.
It's interesting because it really is one of the biggest fears of all musicians. It's their art, it's their heart, their art. And there's this fear of putting it out there. But I always, at the end of the day, you've got to take that risk. You've got to, otherwise you're just going to be the best thing on your shelf behind you and never seen. So it's taking that risk, but putting all the precautions into place as much as you can to protect. Yeah.
And knowing that the best artists out there get their work stolen all the time. And in fact, more often than not, it is the best artists out there that get their work stolen all the time. They usually have a little bit more financial means to bring lawsuits in order to protect themselves. But
exactly. Just looking at some of the things that, because we're talking about what creators need to know to protect themselves. Is there anything else other than what we've talked about? This has been very geared towards musicians, but maybe in the acting world, for example, you deal with all sorts of angles, don't you? In terms of what do you mean by what they need to know to protect themselves? Because you are a bit of a professor as well. I know you give some courses, and which is very, very interesting. Tell me about that, actually. That's very interesting that you're educating, aren't you, basically?
I am. I teach at LA Film School, Los Angeles Film School here in LA on Hollywood and Vine, which has an amazing music recording program, an amazing A&R program. I teach entertainment business law and entertainment business ethics. As it relates to actors, and this also goes for musicians as well, there's kind of this common misconception that people think that they own their right to likeness, and they really don't. You can own a copyright of yourself into the extent that you own a picture and you own a copyright of that picture, and that one picture cannot be infringed upon as part of you are the copyright owner. With regard to your likeness, there is no sort of universal United States federal law that protects one's right of self, right of likeness. There is no federal right of likeness in the United States. There are 50 states, of which 39 to 40 of them have a state law right of likeness, right of privacy, right of publicity in some states, but all of them vary from state to state. California and New York obviously being the most prolific, but a state like Iowa, which I'm not well versed on Iowa state law, don't get me wrong, or this isn't my expert opinion, this is just an offhand example, but they may not have the strongest name, voice, and likeness law. So someone living in Iowa may not have the same recourse for having their image stolen the way that a celebrity in California does. And until we recognize some sort of fundamental nationwide right of self, right of likeness, you should ultimately be very weary of how your image is being taken, who owns the copyrights to any photos that you are having done of yourself. I talk about this in my class a lot. When I'm hiring a photographer for my wedding and events, I'm making sure that in the contract it says I own the copyright to those photos, and that they can't use my likeness for their own individual marketing and promotions for their photography business. Same thing for an actor or musician as they're appearing on a podcast or they're getting pictures taken for advertising and publicity. They want to make sure that there are certain boundaries, rules, and restrictions on how people can use their image and likeness, especially nowadays as it relates to AI and deep fakes and stuff like that. I do a lot of podcast appearance releases on behalf of celebrities where, they're going on a podcast to do an interview and they want to make sure that their rights are protected as it relates to the podcast, that they can't, we call it frankenbiting or frankenbits, where they're taking images or sounds from one part of the interview and making it seem like you're saying something. How it can be used in other episodes, how can it be used in advertising and promoting? Can it if it's somebody on a podcast and they're very religious, can like gun advertisements be shown? I don't know, things like that.
Right.
But there are a multitude of things to be aware of as it relates to image and likeness, especially if you're appearing on a podcast like this.
It's so interesting because I never even thought about that, the likeness. Yeah. That's bizarre. That never even occurred to me. How interesting. So it's a thing. It's a real big thing then.
Yeah, technically, you own the copyright to this recording that we have of each other. California is a two-party consent state. I've consented to this being recording. You own the copyright to the final thing. I don't have much recourse if you take this and monetize it. And I shouldn't be saying this, but in a multitude of different ways.
The evidence. But I guess
it is trying to release. So it's a double-edged sword. I haven't had my rights sufficiently explained, but neither have you. So
I'm interviewing a lawyer. Very interesting.
Yeah, I know, right?
Exactly. But it's interesting as well what you're talking about. And I guess, my head went to that word manipulation, manipulating, and putting things out of context. Like you're talking about something that might be religious orientated and then putting it amongst guns or something that is completely inappropriate. And I think you're talking about this. But I mean, how much control do you really have? Because you look at TikTok, you look at, that's another whole area, TikTok. I take quite a lot about TikTok and YouTube as well. And
YouTube more than TikTok. I'm slowly adopting and getting more and more familiar with TikTok. But this is something that I talk in my ethics class. When I started my legal career in 2010, at the time, cell phones were starting to become kind of more of what we know them to be smartphones and accessing the internet and transferring data between phones and stuff like that. At the time, there were no laws or protections or recourses with the law for what we now call now and know as revenge porn. Right? Those were laws that had to be established as technology became more prolific. Because in 2001, in my flip phone, whatever, I couldn't take a picture and send it. And if I could, it was, like a pixelated blur or whatever. But as technology caught up with that, the law had to too.
Yes.
And nowadays we're seeing things where students are taking images of their classmates and using them in deep fakes in inappropriate ways. Right. So eventually the law will have to catch up to that as well.
Right. Oh, you're going to be very, very busy, aren't you? Because the trouble is technology is fantastic technology now, isn't it? Like you say, and keeping up with technology and the law, keeping up with that as well. It's a bit like also giving therapy as I'm also a therapist. There's a new law coming out for therapists, counselors, psychotherapists when working online, because working online wasn't really a thing until recent years, so you've got two settings instead of just one, and it's constant updating, constantly upgrading. This is exhausting, isn't it? It's
sometimes
exhausting.
It's exhausting to think that in 2014 streaming wasn't really a thing or didn't exist, and now it's we're almost 2024, 10 years later, and we're now going back to a way of viewing television where we're going to have commercials, and it's essentially going back to where we were in 2014. So I don't know. It is interesting.
It is very, very interesting. So it's keeping up with the times, and it's keeping up with the law. And who's making the law? I mean, do you kind of contribute to that in terms of like when you're putting paperwork together? Is it what's that like?
So I will say that us transactional lawyers have a lot of impact as it relates to what goes into contracts as standards and practices. You know, when the hashtag Me Too movement came about, and the inclusion movement and stuff like that, we started to incorporate more contractual terms around those things, and you saw that become more this industry standard across contracts across the board. So in that sense, like someone like me does have an impact where it's like, okay, we're now drafting, I've drafted for the first time for a few movies that I've worked on provisions as it relates to to actors' AI likeness and what we can use for digital recreation. So I'm drafting those paragraphs in a contract for the first time. I'm certain somebody will steal that language, reuse it as their own. It will make its way into a form, and then that will become the standard form, and people will keep using it, and it will make its way into contracts. That's just kind of what happens. At the legislative level, there are more senior attorneys than myself that work with the state legislators on specific things. I'm sure I will get into that eventually. I don't right now. It's something on the horizon for sure.
Yeah, I imagine you belong to some sort of you have some sort of a membership specifically for lawyers where you're constantly doing CPD stuff, and constantly this is where you're getting all your information to become updated, just as I am with the therapy side as well. It's kind of important, isn't it, to kind of keep that going, that membership, and to keep updated.
So I'm a member of the Beverly Hills Bar Association. I have now for over 10 years. It's great for staying up to date with the law, but I swear where I stay most up to date is YouTube. That's where I get my minute by minute information about what's happening in Hollywood, what's happening in the entertainment world, what are the rumors about specific casting and actors and film theory, music theory, all of that stuff. So I can't. I don't get paid by YouTube to say this, but I can't express enough how great YouTube is as a learning source if you want to learn these things. There's so many great videos with great music lawyers talking about like the Katy Perry case, the Marvin Gaye Ed Sheeran case, the Marvin Gaye Robin Thicke case. Just go online and look up music law, and you'd be surprised what you can find.
Absolutely fabulous. Absolutely fantastic. Well, it's been an absolute education speaking with you and learning about how to protect yourselves. I mean, is there anything before we sort of come to an end? I mean, is there any kind of important message you want the listener to be left with?
Yeah, I think that is the most exciting time right now because it's never been easier to make a living being an artist. That being said, I think it's never been harder to be a superstar or a mega hit celebrity star than it's ever been. I think that the world is so pocketed and built into these little echo chambers and bubbles that what is popular for one niche group will never be popular for all of the niche groups. And so, I think that artists have to manage expectations on what success means nowadays, because I think that nowadays, again, you can make a living being an artist, and that is cool. I don't know that you ever could have just been Joe Schmo off the street and decide, hey, I'm going to be an artist today and go out and make that your thing and make it your living and be successful at it. But again, I don't think it's not putting people the rock star status like it once did that people, kind of think of.
Yeah, very, very.
Stars, I think Snoop Dogg said the other day he got paid like $40,000 for 40 million streams on Spotify or 400 million streams on Spotify. It was like $40,000. That doesn't pay for his monthly weed bill.
Right. Yeah. Amazing, isn't it? It's crazy, isn't it? Absolutely crazy. What I think you're saying here is there's a lot more. There has been a lot of grey put now in between. Instead of just being a black and white situation, all or nothing, there is a little bit of grey here where artists, and this is great news for artists who are embarking, wanting to do this, make a little bit of a living or money or whatever you want, and work towards stardom. I guess it does depend what they want at the end of the day. It depends what you're happy with and what you're striving for. But the big celebrity status I think you're talking about is, let it be said, it is extremely hard to get there. And it requires.
I think it's harder than it's ever been to get to that celebrity status. But then, I'm from Iowa. I was just back in Des Moines, Iowa a few months ago, and I was just blown away by how many live music venue bars they now have in downtown Des Moines, Iowa, where I was growing up, as a kid. You never were able to find a place where you could listen to live music in Des Moines, Iowa. Now every single bar on the corner has, jazz and rock and all of these places. So it's like, I'm sure no one is breaking the bank, but in terms of, being a artist first and then having a side hustle and making money from other things, like you said, we all have to wear multiple hats nowadays. I think now you can be an artist.
Yes, wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Really useful. And your website is LastineEntertainmentLaw.com. So anybody who is interested in speaking with you, consulting with you, to visit that website. Thank you very much, Joshua, for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to meet with you.
Thank you. And you can find me on Instagram as well at Lastine Law.
Fantastic. I shall definitely be looking for you there.
Thank you, Mel. Thank you, audience.
Thank you very much.